I will present you in a few words. So
Okay.
we are in the International Congress Lo que América Latina hace a la ecología política. After these two panels, we will now enter to the keynote conferences. The first one is by Susana Hecht. This is one of the founders of the political ecology approach. So we are very happy that Susana reached us and take part to this conference. For all the people working and doing investigation,
Sorry, I didn't want my dog to keep barking. So there you go.
For all the people doing investigation in Brazil or in Amazon regions, the books of Susana are very important references. So it's not worth to present really Susana Hecht, which is one of the key thinkers of political ecology. I know that Susana has like a part-time job in Geneva now, so we hope that we will have meeting one day in Paris with Susana, but for this time it will be like distancial discussion. And then we will have the second keynote conferences with Erik Swyngedown that I will present afterwards. So Susana, I think you have the floor. So your presentation is here, and we try to keep some times at the end for questions. So
yes. So go ahead. Well, I'll just barge in. You know, this happens with these things. First of all, I yearn to see you all in Paris, and it's only a 3-hour train ride from Geneva. So this is something that we can look forward to in the next year. And I think since we are in lockdown right now, looking forward is one of our favorite activities. The second thing that I'd like to say too is that political ecology in Brazil is has such a diverse intellectual and institutional formation that it's really in many ways a powerhouse in political ecological thinking, even if people don't call themselves political ecologists. The other thing I'd also like to emphasize is, while I could talk about the contemporary situation, I think what I want to talk about more is the sort of evolution of a particular strain in political ecology that comes from archaeology and history, as well as contemporary history, and ecology. But because there has been this fundamental structural and intellectual change about what is Amazonia, which is not that it's at the end of the world and beginnings of time, but rather that it has an extraordinarily complex history, and that this history actually can be, if you will, a platform for the future, rather than, I don't know, living in history's oubliette. So I'm going to talk briefly about what is political ecology. I'm going to talk very shortly about what the evolution, why there's this particular conjunction. I now look at Berkeley political ecology as kind of the Berkeley Annals school. It has kind of a long durability. It's been going on for a while and successfully reproducing itself amongst a number of different kinds of institutions. So it's important to think of it in that way. The other thing is that I think that Latin America has had an extraordinary impact on political ecology more generally. This is not to say that scholars like Michael Watts or Judith Carney, or in Indonesia, my colleagues Christine Paddock and Nancy Peluso haven't been important. It's simply that the embrace of the ideas and the way that Amazonia is, you cannot stay very easily within disciplinary boundaries. And so there's all the institutions have been very fluid in terms of embracing it. So one, it's political ecology. You've probably been listening to all of these for the last day, but it's across multiple disciplines, and it deploys multiple disciplines. And I think this is the key thing, that you cannot be a political ecologist and do not be working in several kinds of things, in several kinds of arenas. The other thing is it has historical framings, it has ethnographic roots, but also very strong scientific roots. And I think this is particularly important, and we really see this a lot with the Brazilian work. The other thing is it is scalar in its understandings, and as they say, critiques of pure localism readings, which has been a problem in a lot of different kinds of case study research. So what political ecology does is it doesn't just stay in one place in one time, but goes through time and through space and through scales. So it's a very complex kind of approach to understanding these problematics. For political ecologists in Amazonia, the question was always the idea of progress and development as a hegemonic practice and its meaning. So it was always very good at coming up with critiques. And what's been important is that the alternatives have been so extraordinarily developed through a complex of archaeology, anthropology, geography, historical ecology, and so on. The other thing is it has a long history of looking at representations, epistemes, that is how Amazonia is framed and what it permits you to do, and ontologies about ways of being in the world. These questions of ontologies now, I think, are becoming ever more important as the kind of Western ontology seems to be leading us into kind of a catastrophic future. The other thing that I think political ecology is especially good at is that it's good at looking at emergent processes, properties, and cascades. So it doesn't just stop at one sort of set of conclusions, but that the processes that produce the question one is looking at also have a bunch of emergent properties that are also in the process itself. So in this sense, it's much less bounded intellectually and politically. The other thing is it's especially good for finding invisibilities. And of course, the issues of race, gender, histories, practices, and so on, and I'll go through that a lot. It is particularly important, I think, for placing Spanish and Portuguese issues within the issue of imperiums, but as has recently been discussed, how do you hide an empire? It's been very good at revealing the nature of US imperial activities, and particularly its role during the Cold War. So one of the sort of framing things and the sort of inspiring things is that, in the sense of inspiring analytics, has been the US hegemony in the Cold War and its transformation, and now the shift into the Chinese sphere. I've mentioned that Brazil is a kind of anal school for political ecology. Its Amazonian scholars see each other a lot. Now we see each other all the time on Zoom or whatever platform we're on. But it's important to realize that Braudel taught at USP, the University of Sao Paulo, and he was a big fan of Euclides da Cunha. Thomas Skidmore, a famous historian of Brazil, and I actually conspired and thought that Braudel was copying Euclides da Cunha when he founded the Anal School, but that's a personal predilection that has to do with Euclides da Cunha. The other thing is that it also had many political ecologists avant la lettre, particularly in the environmental humanities and environmental history, and environmental politics, actually. And so Euclides da Cunha comes up most prominently with that, but there are all these wonderful Northeastern writers and poets who talk about the questions of environment, politics, and justice and injustice through the lens of the Northeastern ecologies. And D'Acunha very particularly did that, but also then moved on to Amazonia. So I think that Latin America is in many ways sort of course I would think this, is the beating heart of the early political ecology and has taught all of us, if you will, how to think in terms of political ecology. And also as Amazonia moves from being an ultra periphery to be one of the central intellectual questions of the modern world in terms of whether it will hit a tipping point and whether the climate will be able to survive the current onslaughts, is a major set of questions. And also, of course, Amazonia has moved from being sort of an afterthought in economic policy in the Amazon countries to being, again, its beating heart. It's moved very centrally into their economic sphere as they have adopted more extractivist or neo-extractivist development, whatever we mean by development these days, things. So let me go over the structure of the talk. First of all, I think Amazonian thought and experience is as generative of social thought and social theory. And I would also point out that the French contribution in this area has been extraordinary. Also, the Brazilian researchers and historians have been particularly important in this. But it's important to remember that Amazonia began as kind of an ecological and biotic terrain. And it has been absolutely essential in the evolution of sciences. And it's important to realize this because the scientific weight of Amazonia is so much heavier, if you will, and has been so much more generative of a lot of different kinds of ideas than we understand it as its implications for social theory. I think it's changing. I think Amazonia is going to be as generative for social theory as it has been for the sciences. It's also important to recognize that Amazonia was not just the biggest, the most complex, the most diverse, but that actually it was and there's wonderful research on this by historians of ideas about how much indigenous interlocutors on Amazonia and deciphering Amazonia for these European colonialists and its traveling scientists, how important that was for European scientists. And of course, the names that leap to mind include those of Alexander von Humboldt, but Wallace and Bates were right there with them, really relying on scientific interlocutors. And we could sort of look at indigenous science as being sort of foundational in the structuring of modern science, even though, of course, they don't get much credit. I've mentioned already the issue of Latin American empire and the Cold War, and that also Amazonia and its occupation gave a lot of legitimation to the authoritarian regimes at a time when there was much to criticize them. So they were able to mobilize Amazonia as kind of a nationalist project and a development project under which pressing issues such as agrarian reform and other kinds of economic activities could be dislocated from the areas of conflict into what they thought of as the void. The other thing that's very important, I think, is that in terms of American environmentalism and its importance globally as a kind of model, a traveling model, Amazonia was very essential for decentering Amazonian environmentalism from its narratives, and I'm going to go through that in a minute. And also, it's important to recognize the durabilities of cultural complexity and ontologies. I've mentioned, that's ways of being, that's ways of thinking about nature, ways of being in the world, and whether these really constitute keys to the future. So the first thing I'm going to do is just I was going to talk a little bit about UC Berkeley and all of that, but I'm not so sure that that's so fruitful. What I think is going to be, I'll mention a few things, which is that, first of all, Amazonia in general was sort of seen as, it was very indecipherable. So when you think about legibility for those who were coming into it, it was almost impossible to understand. And thus, of course, it needed a lot of local and indigenous interlocutors. But the point also is that in its invisibilities, in its uncanniness, it was seen also as a place of unusual potential for creating ex nihilo, new kinds of states, new kinds of ways of being, new utopias, if you will, because they were lands without king, creed, or law. So in this, it could be a space of providence for church and state. It was also seen as, in the words, the great words of Euclides da Cunha, the last unfinished page of Genesis, with the texts of history still to be written on that landscape. And so in this sense also, we might think of the last unfinished page of Genesis being the sixth extinction, but that's that's another story. But in any case,
will it be possible to do your presentation a little bit bigger?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thank you, because we received some comments. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no, sorry, I can see it perfectly. So, needless to say, it was easy for me to read. Okay, so you can see this better now, yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So, amongst the various ideologies, and this is discussed throughout its history, it's that lost paradise, it's the El Dorado. It's also been very important for the nation state formation, and I think it's states' inability to handle this area has been one of the sort of driving themes, certainly of the 20th century and increasingly of the 21st. The other thing, of course, is the land without evil, the indigenous version of the Terra Sem Mal, which was a sort of indigenous utopia, of which there are many, by the way. So I just wanted to put up this idea that in thinking of this place as inchoate, as a land without history, it has meant that there's been quite a bit of it failed intervention, and it's ignored actually the powerful history that informs political ecology and could also be more of a platform for contemporary development. Well, I'm putting up this first picture of Amazonians, and this is 1494. It's in the Vatican. And I thought I would of the Munduruku warriors, so that this question of cultural continuity, at least in terms of body painting and hairstyles, does continue over time. So this is an important element, which is, in spite of the kinds of traumas that went through this, that the region has gone through, including the loss of 95% of its population, it's been able, in spite of constant onslaughts, to really maintain a kind of cultural resilience and cultural sustainability and landscape sustainability that has been truly remarkable. There's some, anyway, so I'm going to just, I'm sure we'll be able to work on this more as we go along here. But one of the things that was very important about Amazonian political ecology is it was very good at undermining what had been the sort of narratives in American ecological languages about about environmental problems. One was the erasures of history, in the idea of that there were pristine areas that could be set aside outside of history and that had always been outside of history. The other was that endangered species would have been, that somehow you could give them a legal protection that would save them from other kinds of things. It became very important. The other was that the market approach was essentially one of point solution. It looked at Coasian issues of market failures and regulation as being the ways that you saw this, that it was not really something that inhered in the activity itself, but that it was a market failure. The other thing, so what the point here is that what political ecology began to do was to say, well, actually that inappropriate technology isn't a policy failure. The pollution isn't a market failure, and that the driving dynamic is not Malthusian population, but some other kind of thing that actually inheres in the issue itself. So I don't know what you're seeing on your screen, but I hope you're, are you able to see both sides of this?
No, we don't have your presentation, Susana.
You don't have it? Okay, I'm sorry about this. This is kind of, let me do this. I'm gonna close the presentation and come back on with it. You have to communicate with me what is going on here because I can't see. It was fine for a while and now it was hell, Survivor said. So let me do this. I'm gonna go out of my presentation. I'm gonna close my file here and then come back on because I think that's.
Okay. There is always technical failures, and it's the moment for us to experiment that. I think Susana will come back and follow with her presentation. Yeah. You know that you can find some more informations on Susana and others keynote speakers on the websites of the Congress, Ecopol. There is link for the ones who want to know more about their publications, because we don't have so much space for giving bibliographic tips, but please, if you are interested, go to the Ecopol websites and you will find there more information on the 5 keynote speakers. Susana, he's back.
I'm back. Really, and now I'm going to present my entire screen. No, not that. Let's go here. I'm going to open this. And then we're going to miraculously move forward here. I'm going to present now. I'm going to present a window. I'm going to do this, and here we go.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so now we're just going to stay in this sort of stasis.
Go on.
Okay, so let me talk quickly about UCB. Partly it depended on a really good historical geography, and I realize we're going through I won't be able to get because of my technical issues here. William Denneman, who was very important in historical demography, particularly on the Great Dying, and also on indigenous knowledge systems. Of course, that had a Marxist orientation. It had very good science training in the forestry school, and it insisted on fieldwork and multi-methods. So the implications of this sort of historical framing was that representations count, the empty Amazon, primitivism, pre-scientific and pre-civilizational ideas that soils prohibit civilization, the crappy soils there, really were important in actually liberating the space from any kind of historical claims. The other thing is, as I mentioned, the historical demography and the so-called emptiness made it possible for utopian experiments and rethinking this in a kind of new register as a place on which a new history could be inscribed. Hidden histories all over the place. The structural processes, which I just mentioned, were really important and changed through this. And the authoritarian politics of development were also exchanged through these kinds of dynamics within political ecology, both within Berkeley, but also very importantly, within Brazilian institutions such as NIA, the Museu Jeudi, the Institute for Research, the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, and the Federal University. So one of the things is that there were two real central approaches. One was studying down, looking at stuff in the past, and also in a very micro way, and also studying up. So looking at international corporations, global flows, the dynamics of change and the movement of models as being mechanisms through which you could come to understand this. So what was implied in this was a movement from pristine landscapes to constructed worlds, and the way that that was done. So partly through archaeology of landscapes and soils, but what this did is it moved the realm from not just lost cities or, poetic tribal practices, but into lost empires in the tropics. And it's important to understand that there were truly empires that evolved and developed in Amazonia, and their extent was all through the Caribbean into Florida. And the other thing was that we have, of course, globalizations and their shapings. I'm just going to throw a few pictures up partly because these are old petroglyphs, 14,000 years. So Amazonian occupation is going back all the time. I'm going to fly over some of this. The other thing is that the idea of everybody not having really any metal work and so on is a little bit belied by the extraordinary gold work. The other thing is, if we move on to the realm of landscape, what you see are extraordinary engineering feats. These are the raised fields of the Beni in Bolivia, and they're all over Amazonia, in Ecuador, in British Guyana, in Brazil. So the point here is that you had actually a rather sophisticated level of understanding, both of metallurgy, of landscape engineering. You had ritual burials and so on. And you had, of course, these extraordinary geoglyphs, which are large scale, they're called geoglyphs, but they're actually engineering works that were both ceremonial and in some cases military, and also the creation of an extraordinarily complex biota. So rather than having a biota that really was existing out of time, this was a biota that had been shaped through the history of human occupation. One of the most important findings, in addition to this complexity that now is being revealed of these, extraordinary engineering societies, but they didn't build in stone, but they certainly left their traces on the earth. And one of the most important ones was through this issue of Amazonian dark earths, which are the sort of fundamental. If you want to think about what ADE is, if you think about how many imperial areas in the world depended on terracing, that's one way that people intervened in the landscape to produce agricultural surpluses in places that seemed marginal. Irrigation is another. On the very poor soils of Amazonia, this slash and char, here a Kayapo woman doing this under contemporary conditions, produced a kind of soil that is amongst the most productive in Amazonia, and it's totally anthropogenic, and it's all over the place, as you can see from this slide. So the implications now of all of this was that it really changed how you could think about Amazonia. You could think of it in terms of large populations. You could think of it in urban populations, that it was constructed from the ground up, that these were engineering societies. They were rooted in a diversity of systems and practices. They shifted not just, it wasn't just that they had dense populations on near the rivers, but also into the interior. The knowledge systems are still in use and critical to current alternatives. And the tropical histories of urbanism in aqueous lands are very different from the ideas of urban genesis from the Middle East, which tends to dominate how people think about how cities evolved. And under the ideas of rising waters, it may be that Amazonia has quite a bit more to teach us. The other thing is aquatic and arboreal epistemes are quite different from how we think about land and cropping. So in a sense, and also the relations that one has with these. So in a certain sense, the past is providing us with extraordinary implications for the future. And not the least are things like the ideologies of the Pachamama here, which then actually get incorporated into the politics and constitutional ideas that we begin to see written into the laws after the end of the authoritarian period. So I've sort of leapfrogged here from prehistory into contemporary history, but the point is that these ideas and these ways of occupation were actually came to be legitimized in many of the constitutional dynamics that occurred beginning with Brazil in 1988, but throughout all the Amazonian countries. The other thing is that there are other important elements that tend not to be included in Amazonia history. One is the diasporic Amazon, which is hybridized between African and indigenous and white technologies, reinventions of race, new land regimes, new landscapes, and they're much more extensive than you might think. If you can find old books of photographs of the Amazon, you often see images like this of indigenous populations with very clearly African denizens as well, and the rise of quilombos. These are the sort of Amazonian slave refuges, which, given the probability of surviving slavery, represented really a life and death choice. And what you can see here in this particular slide, let me expand it up a little bit for you, is how extensive these are in Amazonia. And they're even more extensive if you start to put the Bolivian and the Colombian ones in as well, and Peruvian. So the point is that the occupation of the interior really has an important historiography linked to the African diaspora, and the landscapes do as well in the crops. The other thing that we might want to think about too is that people have a short memory about what went on in this place. So even as recently as the last century, the rubber boom dominated the landscapes, and it was like a filigree everywhere. But what you see now is a description of the Purus. This is the Purus. Oh, oops, excuse me. This is the Purus River over here, and it looks like a little caterpillar because each one of these is a named stop. But what you have here is the reinvention of the wild as a means of a kind of a land grabbing. But that caterpillar also extended back. And so these are through the varaduros and the extractive trails. The point here is that Amazonia has these deep histories that also incarnate into the present. This is, of course, Chico Mendes, whose social movements still continue today, even though he is a martyr to cattle ranching. But the point here is that political ecology did begin to link these long terms of historical occupation within the debates over land and the social movements that attended them. So the other thing is that this became both the indigenous and Quilombo and other kinds of social movements basically became the foundations of green governance, which of course all of this has been discussed and analyzed through the lens of political ecology. I'm not going to go through this because I'm running out of time. But the other thing that we have to address is not just how shall we say, analyzing down and going back through time, but also going big, going up, and going through to the present. So this is from Oaxaca, and this is about transgenic development in Mexico. No one can quite match the capacity for drawing skeletons that the Mexicans have, but these are sort of this is the current, to quote, drive your tractors over the bones of the dead. These are essentially the expanding universe of Amazonian activities, largely meant for livestock and soybean largely being consumed in Asia, a little bit in in Europe. So the point here is that we're starting to see large-scale displacement. So we have these models from the past and from social movements that actually are operating in the contemporary moment, but that are now competing with a modernized and modernist kind of agriculture that basically destroys extraordinary diversity and complexity for one species, and in the case of cattle, maybe for 3 species. So what's happened then is that we have a kind of sustainable and highly resilient set of systems that now are being assaulted by uneven development policies produced by shadow clandestine economies and unstable economies at multiple scales. So what's driving these right now is land grabbing and land frauds, land speculation, illegal logging, contraband of multiple types, illegal mining, and that mining should be, this is just for your jewelry, you know. It's extraordinary. Massive corruption, of course, all those big dams, all that big infrastructure, a lot of illegal clearing, high rates of internal migration, and of course, a highly violent frontier. Now, even given that, what was possible using the ideologies and the politics of Amazonia as a platform, not as a obstacle to development, human well-being, was that there was about a period from 2004 to 2014 where deforestation rates fell by over 70%. Now, some of this reflected leakage, deforestation elsewhere, but what happened was really this dynamic of more environmental institutions, aligned governance, and green commodity chains, participatory regional actions and actors, a science-based policy, but a science-based policy that was also engaging indigenous knowledge, social institutions to support livelihoods, and social movements for equity. So it's important to realize that that stuff from the past did not simply die away, but actually began to inform policy in a significant way. Well, what we have now, of course, is a natural experiment where essentially we've removed all the things that I've described here and essentially done policy rollbacks, no enforcement, no further protected area demarcations, an economic extractivist development problem. There's virtually no economic environmental costing or externality accounting, so that the only cost benefit there is there's no cost, and the benefits are simply accrued to those who can capture these resources. So defunding of research. And then what you can see here is, of course, a rise in the deforestation dynamics rather extensively. So what we have now is a kind of eco-necropolitics, and this is even worse because when you start to do this kind of deforestation, what you get is not just the pulse and the long-term stuff of carbon sitting in the atmosphere, but also you have to forego the capture of carbon that existed with that forest before. So this has meant that there's been about a 600% increase in what the carbon loss of what these deforestations are doing. The other thing is that while we've been talking about this as a rural story, actually Amazonia has a long urban history, and it's now extremely urbanized. It's 70 to 80%. These livelihoods really depend on multi-sided households who move back and forth between cities as they flood and resources as they become available. And it's important to realize that this may be an urbanization model that might have more relevance for the tropics than Sumerian urbanization and other forms of historic urbanization. The other thing is that urban livelihoods now are composed of, Amazonian livelihoods include both urban components as well as rural components. And so the construction of livelihoods is not one of these things where migration is you just migrate to the city and then have a precarious life, but it's a constant kind of transhumance between the rural and the urban. And not surprisingly, most of these rural components are forested because you can control the labor flow a lot better, and it's easier to do. So finally, I'm going to end up here, and I'm sorry for the little technical glitches here, but one of the things that I'd like to just point out is that when we're talking about indigenous activities and indigenous history, I want to emphasize that indigenous is not niche, that in part they just run around naked and paint themselves red version of the indigenous ignores their political activism over the last 2 centuries, and also the extraordinary contributions to European science and working production systems. The Amazonian domesticates were extraordinarily globally transforming. Quinine sort of facilitated tropical colonialism. Manioc got Africa over its calorie deficit. Sweet potato enhanced the sort of Malthusian trap of Asia. And so it's very important you could not have had the Industrial Revolution without rubber. So in one sense, when you start to reposition Amazonia in a more central way, what you see is that the political ecologies of it are quite astonishing, and also that its impact has been much, much greater than it's usually seen as an ultra periphery rather than a foundational center. The other thing is that whatever is the story with these populations, they have been very resilient, and that their capacity to survive in ethnic complexity has continued, and those systems continue as well. The other thing is indigenous movements are not just sort of tribal movements themselves, but have been increasingly engaging, and have been for the last 50 years, global environmental politics and global human rights politics. This is a picture from Geneva last fall. So finally, I'm going to end up here with the famous phrase, Minerva's owls fly at dusk. These are actually owls ground burrowing owls in Amazonia after a fire. And you can see they have a rather resentful look. But what's important to keep in mind here is that when we think about political ecology and Latin America's contribution to it, I would argue that Amazonia has had perhaps an oversized influence in transforming both the way we think about the tropics, not as some, pathetic environmental residua that history has passed by, but rather as an important driver in history. And also that it has been, if you will, a nursery for political ecology. And just to quote the recently passed Kayapo leader, Pablo Payakan, who points out that a forest is one big thing. It has plants, it has animals, and it has people. So in this sense, Amazonia can provide us perhaps with clues to how we might confront our future rather than burning it up. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing. Again, my apologies for stuff. And I'm going back to you. I'm here.
Okay, Susana, thank you.
Okay.
For this very fruitful presentation. We had a question of Pablo on big international NGOs.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think about the action of big international NGOs like Nature Conservancy, WWF across Latin America?
Well, they have a model that is primarily located in the idea of the set aside and in many ways the commodification of nature. So for this reason, they were very active in promoting things like REDD, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and also have been very active in land set-asides. For a long time, they were very resistant to the idea of humanly occupied lands as having conservation value. They have come around on this, but they remain, it depends on how well they're interacting with local populations and local communities. It's important, what I think you see on the ground is that people are fairly, how shall we say, transactional and careful about interacting with these groups, partly because of this long history of essentially green land grabs that occurred so frequently in Amazonia. Next question.
I have perhaps personal questions.
Sure.
I find your books very inspiring. I don't know if you hear about these concepts coming from social studies of science.
Mm-hmm.
Is true spots, no? And in my own studies on biology of tropical forests, I have the impression that we can define in a perhaps paradoxist way that tropical forest and Amazonia could be a kind of true spot of these three last decennies. I think that Amazonia and tropical forest for environmental science have been a kind of true spot, no? Because it could be for biodiversity or for climate science. Amazonia has been really a place where perhaps the more important finding have been done. And my questions is perhaps to go a little bit more, and because I think you point on this perhaps that in anthropology it was a true spot too. No, now we can say Amazonia is one of the main place where anthropology is on the front line. So you can comment this, no? Not just for biological sciences, but for anthropology too. Amazonia is, since like 30 years, a kind of true spot.
Mm-hmm. What I would say is that you can't work in Amazonia in a monodisciplinary way. and that what it actually requires, it's very difficult to sort of isolate yourself from the other processes that are going on, even if you are an ornithologist or something and you don't really care about processes of development. Development is coming for your birds, so in a certain sense, people have to be more broadly engaged. And so this is why what you see quite frequently so I agree with you that it is a kind of a truth spot, in the sense that it is a place in which the politics that underpin the livelihoods and understandings become much more salient. I'm not sure if that's really answered your question, but the other thing is that it is very generative of ideas, because it's a very rich place in terms of the processes that it's undergoing, whether these are contemporary processes like drilling for oil, or these longer histories of things like the Terra Preta do Índio. These are longer term processes that somehow change the paradigms through which people have been looking at things. So this is why I spent so much time on these sort of the recasting of Amazonia, not as a periphery or a place that never had civilizations, but how all this work actually transforms what we understood about the past. And through as political ecology, which gets the environmental history, archaeology, anthropology, get you to political ecology, how you can begin to analyze through these other understandings, the contemporary dynamics. So the thing that's important here is that it's provided a platform for alternatives, both for social movements and also for the technical alternatives, explaining and exploring the alternatives to what are unsustainable monocultures that are expanding very rapidly over the region.
I think the discussion of how to categorize Amazonia as a margin of globalization, or at the contrary, like a light for media, not to look for other environmental problems, is very interesting. Perhaps in your discussion with Erik Swyngedown, which is more focused on urban political ecology, it could be interesting to discuss on this. No, is Amazonia a margin of globalization, or, as you said, a point where we can look all the history of globalization, or do give too much attention to Amazonia in cooperation with other urban environmental problems or so on? No, it's just like how to consider Amazonia as very important or as marginal problem.
Well, my view, of course, and I would obviously think this, is that it's much more central than one realizes. Partly it's it has that green gloss on it of the sacred forest, the extraordinary forest that is the scientized world, and that sort of dominates how people think about it. But it's important to realize that it's been in gold markets forever. It's been in numbers of commodity markets forever. There's been huge amounts of transfer of Amazonian germplasm and goods from Amazonia all the way through various steps into the southwest of the US in cacao, for example. So it's had an extraordinary structuring effect. Also, as I mentioned, if you start to think about the great divergence and how the great convergence comes back, one of the things is you really do have to look at the role of quinine that facilitated imperialism everywhere, and that essentially these Malthusian bottlenecks in Africa and particularly in Asia were overcome by tropical root crops. They produced 20 metric tons per hectare versus 1.5 of rice, for example. So in a certain sense, it freed up the expansion of humans on the planet. The other thing is that I think that while we have the sort of Western dominance of the temperate zone versions of urbanism and urban history, I think we have a different story that's emerging in Amazonia about basically a different kind of urbanism that isn't really so fixed on the land, that it's more aqueous. And as I keep saying, we may be looking to Amazonia a great deal for how we might respond to sea level rise in cities all across the world now. The other thing is that there's lots of stuff that is being, first of all, it really is magnificent. And the representation of it as, these magnificent forests has been important for it in its ability to mobilize certain kinds of conservation funds, as well as for its forest protectors. And to give them international support in what is turning out to be a very vicious land war. But the other thing is that it has a long urban history. If you can see this all over the place. If you, in the Beni, in the Guyanas, Belém, all the major towns are on top of previous urban areas. So Iquitos, Manaus, Santarém, Belém, just to give you a few. So it's important to realize that if we're looking to sort of overcome limitations, Amazonia actually has a lot of rather interesting elements of transformation within the modern time. The other thing is, one of the most important elements that it has is its capacity to grow trees. It sucks up about 2 billion metric tons of carbon every year. And so that is a sort of engine of, let's say, planetary survival. And also that I didn't get into this because it's another sort of complex story and lecture, but that its disruption of its internal weather patterns will basically undo the atmospheric rivers that are currently supplying rainfall to the rest of South America. So through Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and then, of course, the central plains of Brazil and into Sao Paulo. Once you start to cut that supply off of these atmospheric rivers, then what you have are mega cities which don't have a water source. So these are very complex questions in which a lot pivots on Amazonian, potentially pivot on Amazonian dynamics. So of course I think it's the center of the world rather than some ultra periphery. I'm required to think that, but I think that actually empirically this is also the case. It looks like there.
Thanks a lot for this inspiring talk, Susana. We have to give the floor to Erik Swyngedown.
Okay.
So Erik, welcome. We are very happy that you accept to give this talk. Perhaps some of Latin American scholars know you better for your work on Ecuador, which is perhaps a little bit old for you, but it's still very known there in Latin America. You are a geographer from the University of Manchester, a very, very prolific author. It's impossible to cite all your books on hydrocracy, on Anthropocene. All your critique on Anthropocene is very well known too. You are mainly perhaps a specialist on political economics. Perhaps you will not define you exactly as a political ecologist, but you have discussed a lot with political ecologists, and you maintain a critical stake on political ecology. But I think that quite all the people working on water politics and on urban politics have read your book, so we have all something to learn from your work. Thanks a lot for being here, and you have the floor. Thank you, Erik.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, David, for the invitation. I hope you can all hear me. Can you see my slide?
Perfect.
Perfect, okay. Thank you very much, Susana, for a fantastic talk. It's a very tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. As David already said, I am not really a Latin Americanist or a Latin American political ecologist. I happen to have worked quite a lot in Latin America in the 1990s. And as David said, I did a book on the political ecology of water in Ecuador in the early 2000s, which is currently being translated into Spanish in Mexico. It's coming out in a few months' time, so it will be available in Spanish too soon. My talk this evening is to try, on the one hand, to chart what the multiple influences and transformations of what we call the political ecology have been over the past 20 or 30 years or so, and to raise for ourselves some questions. What is it that we're doing, and why are we doing this? My whole life, academic life, I've always borrowed from all manner of epistemic communities, both in disciplinary terms. I'm an engineer, for God's sake, by training, but I also borrowed from the French, the Italian, the Spanish, the Latin American, African, and of course, Anglo-Saxon tradition. So that is what I would like to talk about with you this evening. And I'm particularly concerned, or the kind of the questions that I think we should ask ourselves: what precisely is the political in political ecology? And what precisely is it that we, political ecologists, want the political to do? So that is the sort of background around which this talk articulates. Since we are in Paris, I thought it was good to start with two quotes from French intellectuals. The first one is by Boltanski and Chiapello, who said, "The capitalist system has proved infinitely more robust than its detractors because it has discovered routes to its survival in critiques of it." The point I want to make is that we, political ecologists, sometimes think of ourselves as hypercritical with respect to the existing social, ecological, and political power configurations. I dispute that. Even more interesting is this quote by Alain Badiou, French philosopher, for those who are not familiar with him, who quite controversially said about 15 years ago, "Ecology is the new opium of the people." Now, for someone like me who thought that political ecology might open a wedge to a path of socio-ecological change and transformation in more socially just and environmentally sensible ways, this statement by Badiou hit hard. And I thought it was worth thinking about what Badiou might mean when he scandalously replaced ecology with, he scandalously replaced religion with ecology in Marx's famous dictum. So the title of my talk is "From Political Ecologies in the Plural to a Critique of Political Ecology," because that's what I argue in this talk we really need. I'm going to make four points. First of all, I'm going to say something about how I see, in a nutshell, given the limited time we have, how I see in a nutshell the historical geographies of political ecologies. And then ask myself and ourselves the question, is there a Latin American political ecology, or a French one, or an Anglo-Saxon one, or an Asian one, or an African one? I think that today, what is the wide pluriverse of political ecologies, they draw on such a wide range of epistemic communities that it's very, very difficult to identify particular geographical epistemic schools, although historically they were definitely there. Then in a third part, I will try to make a case as to why we might want to think of a critique of political ecology rather than to think political ecologies. I want to bring back to mind the Marx's 11th thesis of Feuerbach and the current and the current deadlock, I think, that much of critical thought, including political ecology, is suffering from. To then say a few things about the critique of political ecology, and of course I have shamelessly stolen this statement from Marx's magnum opus, Capital, whose subtitle was A Critique of Political Economy. And I think that's precisely what we need with respect to nature with a capital letter N. Nature, a critique of political ecology. It's basically mimicking, yet hoping to transform what Marx was saying more than 200 years ago, or 170 years ago. And then I think I wanted to conclude with thinking through what it is that sustains our belief that political ecology matters. Because all of us who come together in meetings like this, who read the books that we read, talk the talk we talk, do the research that we do, is driven by a certain fantasy, a view as to why it is important that we do that. And I think we may want to critically interrogate what it is that we do and why we do it. Okay, the historical geographies of political ecologies, I'll do it very quickly. Of course, as we've heard many times today and yesterday, there is a clear Marxian roots to political ecology. In the case of Latin America, unfolded very much in the 1960s, 1970s as by the work of the Dependistas, the colonial legacy, people like Furtado, André Gunde Frank, and then of course the godfather of them all, Enrique Leff. The classic book, Las Venas Abiertas de la América Latina, which is one of the books when I read it, that opened up a new vast space of considering questions of the environment, of nature and resources in articulation with combined and uneven development in the unfolding of capitalism. And then about the same time in Europe, we had an increasing eco-critique, often articulated around issues of what was then called eco-socialism. And again, I put down just a few names here. The list obviously is much longer. André Gorz, Grundmann, Hans Enzensberger, Manuel Castells, David Harvey, Alain Lippias, and many, many others. Of course, by the 1980s, early 1980s, the onslaught on Marx's theory took shape and led to a transformation, a widening, as well as a deepening of what was the kind of budding political ecological work that had been done at the time in what I put here as a post-Marxist transformation. A post-Marxist transformation that quite rightly and clearly paid much greater attention to the gendered and racialized configuration of political ecologies. Also the increasing attention to post-colonial political ecologies and the political ecology of the subaltern became key sort of strata, key domains of political ecological analysis that both deepened and widened the epistemic spectrum of what we call today the political ecology. Alongside with that, and that of course in the wake of a combination of the environmental question becoming increasingly more important on the one hand, and the disintegration of old left politics that had animated Marxism and socialist thought for so long, led to this new sort of species that is a scholar activist. I've been listening again today and yesterday to many representations, and my own generation, myself included, often saw ourselves and still often see ourselves as scholar activists. Those who are concerned with and focus on the political ecologies of resistance. This key word of resistance. I often get PhD students still that say, Professor Swyngedown, I want to do a PhD with you because your work on political ecology is so interesting. I said, fine, what do you want to do? I want to find a resistance somewhere. Then I bring out the map. Well, can we find some ecological resistance on which you can do a PhD or a master's or whatever, kind of scholar activism that embraces our beloved Paul and our beloved subaltern, the kind of focus on the socio-ecologically excluded or marginalized. I think that was a third sort of strand that emerged in the 1980s and became dominant in the 1990s, early 2000s, alongside the two others that I mentioned in the post-Marxist transformation era. Then at about the same time, a bit later, in critical thought more widely, but in political ecology very strongly so, there was an increasing concern with thinking through new ontologies, in which the argument was the old Western colonial, imperial, white, male, binary ontologies upon which we explained the world and acted on the world have to be transcended. They have to be relegated to the dustbin of history. And it was thought that this ontological discussion would be absolutely vital to inaugurate a new ecological politics. So in other words, many started to argue that fundamental ontological re-theorization of our place and the place of others in the world is vital in order to embark on a politicizing trajectory of a more just and ecologically sensible world. Someone like Viveros de Castro has written extensively on that, and the title of a paper he did a few years ago I thought was very illuminating: Who is Afraid of the Ontological Wolf? And some of those ontological or new ontological experiments go under the name of post-human, more than human, new materialist, or situated knowledges, which all try in their different, sometimes complementary, sometimes oppositional ways, try to overcome and contain the kind of modernist, enlightenment, Western, human, non-human divide by articulating the human, non-human assemblage in radically new ways. Latin America has been really at the forefront of that, and I think in particular of Latin American anthropologists like, again, Viveros de Castro, De la Cadena, Arturo Escobar, and of course, more generally and more widely, the increasing emphasis on and the insistence on the importance of indigenous or subaltern knowledges and their associated struggles. Much of that work had a decidedly non-urban bias. It was particularly concerned with indigenous knowledges, indigenous voices, and the processes of successive marginalization and silencing of these different epistemic communities. In parallel to that, in Europe and in the Anglo-Saxon configuration, there was also a wide range of new ontological perspectives that opened up or tried to open up a new set of ideas about how to think the nature-society interface, each of them all with a view on opening up a new political space for transformation. In France, Bruno Latour is one of the most well-known, of course, but there are a wide range of others, very often dwelling in a Foucauldian or Deleuzian sort of perspectives on the new materialism and more than human ontologies, such as they are prevalent today.
Yeah, I think the connection is better with Latin America than with Manchester. I don't know if it's because of the Brexit, but the connections is not so good, and Erik is out of the meeting. I think he's reconnecting, but we have to wait a little bit. Perhaps if we have an interruption, I can do some.
No se escucha, se dice.
¿No se escucha?
No hay sonido, no, ya no se escucha. Aux États-Unis, donc elle n'entend pas.
Gretel, it's okay for the sound?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you now.
Because we are receiving some message in the chat.
Dice, en los Estados Unidos no hay eso.
Ah, no hay sonido en los Estados Unidos.
Pablo Prado dice, sí se escuchó.
Bueno, se escucha desde América Latina, pero desde América del Norte no. Y bueno, quién sabe. Disfruto de la interrupción para decirles que pueden encontrar todos los datos y la bibliografía de Susana Hecht y de Erik Swyngedown en la página web del coloquio, porque no pudimos presentar como se debe Susana Hecht y Erik Swyngedown en el programa, pero en el sitio web van a encontrar toda su bibliografía, muy amplia los dos. Y, well, I don't know if I do speak Spanish or English, but I think it could be interesting really to have this discussion between Amazonian-focused political ecology and urban-focused political ecology. Perhaps we can begin just with the questions, waiting for Erik.
Il y a une question. Pablo Prado. There is one question.
I don't know if someone in the panel want to comment, or Susana, if you want to add something, we can wait, Erik.
I'd be delighted to add something. First of all, I think it's important to realize that there's a lot of more intersectionality that is occurring within the Amazonian debates in political ecology. We could just go on forever. There's so much to discuss. So one of the things is that issue of intersectional processes is important. The other thing I think that's really important is the Bruno Latour and the idea of actants, because and this actually fits with sort of more the indigenous ontologies, which is that non-human organisms are structuring and changing human practices and human life. So one of the things I think that is kind of a convergence between science and technology studies and these studies of ontology is this question about the way that the world interacts with human societies and how humans see their place within these complex interactions between, shall we just say, nature and the human world. The other thing is that this goes very much in contrast to the sort of classic developmentalist view, where history would just be written on top of a obedient landscape, more or less. And what we see now is that this isn't really operating at all. As they say, nature bats last. So I think it's a very interesting set of questions. The other issue, I think, particularly in light of the post-human political ecologies, is the idea of the Pachamama, the idea that trees have standing, the use now of lawsuits being brought by rivers on these kinds of questions. These are sort of the first steps of a kind of a post-human ecology, political ecology, that have these kinds of ontological questions in them, and they're imperfect. They're the stumbling steps, but perhaps they represent an unusual integration between forms of ontology and forms of science as they unfold in political ecology. And again, I would say a lot of the ontological stuff and intersectional stuff that exists very strongly in Latin American and particularly Amazonian political ecology. And also, I would say that the problem that many Brazilians have in they're wonderful historians, they're wonderful political ecologists, they just don't particularly translate their work. So one can sort of see a vibrancy going on within that realm, within Brazil, but it doesn't penetrate particularly well outside it.
I would have a question for Susana, David. Is that okay?
Sí, Elena?
Yeah. Hi, Elena.
Hello, Susana. Nice to meet you, and thanks for your presentation. Yeah, I have a question. I'm really interested in knowing how is the U.S. political ecology's view on the Amazon evolving, particularly in light of China's presence and extractivism in the area. And if I may, another question, I mean, how is also the US political ecology reacting to a prevailing and something that will stay Trumpism attitude towards science and therefore also political ecology? Thanks.
Sorry, Elena, sorry, Susana. I think Erik is back. So if you can take the question.
I've written it down. We do it later.
Thank you, Susana. And Erik, so
yes, I don't know what happened. Suddenly everything was gone. Do you know where it was disconnected?
We will find if you present your PowerPoints. I think we were all waiting what comes after your presentation about our beloved subalterns and all that.
Okay.
You were talking about Bruno Latour, I think.
I see. Yeah. Okay, yes. That was about. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've done that, I think, yes. Okay. So to summarize this off again, what I was trying to argue in summarizing a particular sort of historiography, as I see it from political ecology, that the focus has been on what I call doing the political ecology of capitalism, widely understood, of course. It's very heterogeneous, dynamic, contested configuration, but most of our work has been focusing on the analysis of agents, actors, human and non-human, in the political ecology of capitalism. What I want to think about a bit more is to consider the need for the critique of political ecology. And I want to bring back to mind the 11th thesis, Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, whereby Marx argued that the point, of course, is not just to understand the world, but to change it. So in many ways, I would like to suggest that political ecologists of today were like the Malthuses, the Adam Smiths, and the Ricardos of capitalism in the early 19th century. They called themselves the political economists. And Marx, of course, wrote Capital, a critique of political ecology, exactly because he had in mind both a shift in epistemology, but also with an eye towards transforming and changing the existing configurations. So that is what I mean by a critique of political ecology. Because if we take stock of the extraordinarily important and interesting work that the political ecologists, myself, have been doing, their contribution into just even slightly nudging the existing socio-ecological configuration into a more egalitarian and environmentally sensible transformation has been negligible. Our impact has been almost zero, except among ourselves. So that urges us to think through what I and many, many others today call the end of the critique. That is the political non-performativity of the kind of critical thought that we assume political ecology to be. And I think it actually has a lot to do with the process of disavowing the real of the actually existing, combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. And that is widely illustrated, I think, by the ongoing wars over ontologies and epistemologies, which are, I would argue, a certain fetishized displacement of considering the political as the process, considering the actors, agents, institutions, as well as the future desires of the world that we want to inhabit. So the question, I think, that we have to ask ourselves is how to change it, and to change it into what? What is it that we political ecologists want, desire? So I think we have to move, therefore, from the political ecologies of the past and the present to a critique of political ecology that includes thinking through the transformation to the future. Indeed, the point is not, paraphrasing Marx, to insist on the need to embed our understanding of social life within wider socio-ecological metabolisms and their conflicting dynamics. That is already well known and visible to all. We do that exceedingly well. But to chart the contours that might permit a progressive and emancipatory transformation on the basis of actually existing conditions and possibilities. And I think we're much weaker when it comes to that. So I'm going to give a few thoughts around the critique of political ecology. And that's, of course, thinking through capital's natures, as I call it here. The political struggle over nature, I argue, operates today along two interrelated axes. On the one hand, there are major conflicts raging over the material basis of life and the modalities of access, control, and reproduction of human, non-human, or more than human organic and inorganic matter relations and processes. On the other hand, major contestation unfolds over the meanings of nature, that is, the configurations through which we imagine what nature is, through which we symbolize it, and consequently that shapes the way we relate to it. Secondly, and I think that is not sufficiently foregrounded, is the process of planetary urbanization, planetary extraction, and the uneven and combined socio-ecological circulation of capital. We do all know that capitalism is predicated upon the continuous deterritorialization of extractive matter that re-territorializes as socio-ecologically metabolized commodities through the process of planetary urbanization. The Chilean political ecologist Alboleda just published a fantastic book, The Planetary Mind, that explores this in detail. So in this sense, we were listening earlier to the Amazon, to what's happening in the Amazon, and that's absolutely the center of the world, is directly related to another center, China. The two are mutually implicated and combined, and it is both within the centers and what we previously called the peripheries that both center and periphery coexist and coincide. So planetary capitalist urbanization is made possible precisely by the expansion of planetary mining and globally organized circulation and metabolisms of organic matters such as food, fiber, oil, or wood. In that sense, a critique of political ecology is necessarily a critique of what I would argue urban political ecology, precisely because the circulation of money, bodies, and matter unfolds as a process of the urbanization of capital, as David Harvey called it already back in 1985. There cannot be a political ecology of, let's say, avocado or quinoa or lithium in Latin America's agricultural landscape or mining landscape without considering at the same time the urbanization of avocado, quinoa, or electrical vehicles in the sustainable, quote unquote, woke eco-consumption restaurants of Amsterdam, Paris, Toronto, or New Delhi. It's precisely this combined and uneven configuration that continuously shapes and reshapes the various positions within that metabolic socio-ecological transformation process. And I would argue that needs to be foregrounded much more. Thirdly, I think we should think through what I and others consider the eco-modernizing fallacies of the new, assumedly horizontal human nature ontologies. See, the emergence of new materialist perspectives and more than human ontologies that for some seem to point towards grasping the world and worldly matters in a more symmetrical human, non-human, if not post-human constellation that opens up all manner of diverse multiverses. Indeed, has been central in both nurturing a politics of the pluriverse, as Arturo Escobar would put it, but these ontologies have been equally powerfully mobilized to legitimize hyper-accelerationist eco-modernizing processes. Think of, for example, the Breakthrough Institute that actually mobilizes these more than human ontologies as a way of finding a safety route that permits modernization to accelerate even further while taking into account the non-human configurations in which that modernity unfolds. Indeed, despite its radical presumption, we contend that these new cosmologies open up, not necessarily so, but are being mobilized by some, open up the specter for deepening particular capitalist forms of human, non-human entanglements. And that these ontologies and epistemologies can be corralled to sustain the possibility for a hyper-accelerationist, eco-modernist vision and practice, in which science, geoengineering, terraforming technologies, and big capital join to allegedly save both Earth and Earthlings. So I think this invites the need for a critique of the ontological turn that has been cherished by so many, and to recenter the political as agonistic struggle, as the Laclau or Mouffe would call it. Fourth is we should think about the culture of neoliberalization in a critical sort of way, which means for me traversing identitarian enjoyments. I think in much of the political ecology that has been concerned with questions of the commodification and neoliberalization of capitalism over the past 2 decades, there has been an overemphasis on the process, on the economic process of commodification, accumulation by dispossession, etc. What has been massively ignored is what I and others have called the culture of neoliberalism. That is how the politics of neoliberalism is sustained by a culture of identity and identitarian enjoyments. I think we have to consider what the place is of a focus of enjoying one's identity as an actual support structure for the culture of neoliberalization. And the need perhaps to think of enjoyment articulated around egalitarian eco-social transformation. Or in other words, the question here is, what do political ecologists really desire? So to begin to conclude, I think we might want to think about the unexamined fantasies that support what we do, that makes us believe, really believe, that what we do matters, politically speaking. Perhaps it does not. So what I want to conclude with is to question some of what I think are the key socio-ecological imaginaries or fantasies that sustain our desire to do political ecology or to be a political ecologist. The first fantasy, I think, that sustains much of political ecological work, and more widely, the environmental concern that is shared by most of us, is that we really have to take the question of the environment seriously. That is, that if we do not transform the socio-ecological relations, then sometime in the future, civilization as we know it will come to a premature end or will be massively negatively affected. So we were motivated by a promise, an apocalyptic promise in the future that needs to be averted to a particular type of actions today so that civilization as we know it can continue for a while longer. I think that disavows the actually existing reality of the combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe that is already affecting so many people on Earth. Let me give you a simple example of that. The COVID-19 vaccine is going to be rolled out very, very soon, next year. Who's going to get it? Who will get it when? It is clear that a socio-ecological catastrophe is in the making, in which my body will be protected fairly early on. I'm 65 almost and living in the Netherlands. And compare that with the bodies of those living elsewhere. That is a socio-ecological catastrophe that is happening right now. So I think greater attention has to be paid to the combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe that has already unfolded and is every day unfolding. So, in other words, it is already too late. And my question is, what kind of thought, theory, and actions can we think about if we start from the partisan perspective that it is already too late? And it's certainly too late for many people on Earth, and it has been too late for many people for a very long time. So I think that is the fantasy that has to be re-examined. That is the fantasy of a catastrophic future until we act now. Let's reverse that and think through the implications of that. The second fantasy is that we have to engage with our socio-ecological configuration in the name of human and non-human configurations. There is this implicit assumption that humanity exists. Humanity not understood as a combination of 8 billion individuals on Earth, but humanity understood as something more than the individual that comes with a set of ethical, social, civil configurations and that permit life to be lived in common together with others. I would argue that such humanity does not exist. It has actually never existed. So again, I think we should interrogate as to in whose name and for what purposes we call ourselves political ecologists. What would we do, think and say if we was to start from the assumption that humanity does not exist, but that the challenge, the political challenge, resides precisely in the possibility, if not necessity, of producing in the future some sort of humanity. And perhaps that this process of producing a humanity is precisely what could change the socio-ecological relations to which human and non-human assemblages are sustained. So I suggest to turn around the two basic fantasies that often legitimize the need for environmental intervention or ecological or socio-ecological action. So to conclude, this is my final slide. What I often miss in the wide-ranging literature and extremely exciting and interesting literature that falls under the banner of geopolitical ecology is, what do we want? What is the political fantasy or fantasies? How can they be achieved? And what constitutes the political when we call ourselves political ecologists? Can the political be just identified with forms of socio-ecological activism and resistance? In other words, where is precisely the political as an emancipatory and ecologically sensible procedure of transforming the existing inegalitarian configuration? Where precisely is it? What is it? Isn't it high time to have a debate on the nature of the political and political ecology? So I would like to conclude again with a quote from a French book, which I thought captures this well. It says, the book is called The Coming Insurrection by the Invisible Committee, published in 2009. It was a bit controversial in the US when it came out. It's usual to wait for it's useless to wait for the breakthrough, for the revolution, the nuclear apocalypse, or the social movement. To go on waiting is madness. The catastrophe is not coming. It is here. We are already situated within the collapse of the civilization. It is within this reality that we must choose sides. Thank you very much. I'll leave it with that, and I'll stop sharing now and come back to the main screen. And my apologies for the technical hitch. I don't know what happened. My internet broke down at some point. That's what happens when we have to socially interact in COVID times.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Erik, for this provocating thought. We can speak in English or in Spanish or in French. I have some comments here. Yes, Pablo Prado say that we have to look the abyss directly. Pierre-Yves Callahan is proposing readings, Le Mal qui vient, of Pierre-Henri Castel. And Pierre-Yves Cadalen is want to have some comments more precisely on the 11th thesis of Feuerbach,
Feuerbach, okay. Yeah.
No, but I think perhaps we can just go a little bit further on this idea of humanity is what we have to do to constitute, to build. Yeah. But we have a fragmented world in capitalism society. And I think that if we think to Latour perspective, no, on terrestre,
Yeah.
and I think that pluriversalism, no, if we oppose universalism and pluriversalism,
Yeah.
is another way to look fragmentation and unity. And we can't say that, for example, in Latour terms, there is no politics. I think it's a way to build fragmentation and unity. So did you want really to oppose your perspective with the pluralistic or pluriverse perspective?
Not at all. Not at all. What I was opposing is that the normative political vision for the pluriverse resides in the ontological shift. We just have to believe in the truth of this new ontological way of understanding the society-nature imbroglio, which then in turn will open up the possibility for the making of a pluriverse. That is what I contest. And I think that is predicated upon a mistaken understanding of the assumed contradiction or opposition between particular and universal. Let me give you an example of that. Today, I walk around just like you with a mask on in the street. Yeah? We all walk around with a mask on our face, right? That is universalism. That is where the moment of universalism comes through, because we all know why we do this. It is to save our naked neighbor, yeah, in his or her particularity. That's why the right wing hates masks. That's why Trump hates the stuff. That's what Bolsonaro said, masks is nothing. We don't want that. It's precisely because the moment of universality shines through in the wearing of the mask. And it's precisely, therefore, that understanding of universalism that opens up the possibility of a multiverse. That is of the egalitarian expression of heterogeneous identities and practices. Right? So it's a question of how to get there. Ontology will not do it. Pure and simple. Yeah, that is a form of intellectual masturbation. However interesting it is, I love it too. I think it's important. I do think thought matters. I would not be doing what I'm doing unless I do think that thought and the imaginary is politically performative, but only if thought articulates with a particular set of desires and enjoyments that articulate indeed around making a different world in which the pluriverse can thrive. Of course, capitalism is the combined and uneven geographies of capitalism produce the pluriverse. They produce simultaneously the heterogeneous specialities and practices that Susana was talking about in the Amazon, as it does in my neighborhood here. I'm happy to be in Brussels, in Molenbeek. Yeah, Molenbeek is a very particular part of the city, which is both the center of Europe, is Brussels, yeah, and the most marginalized space in the world at the same time. And my son happens to live here. I'm visiting him here. He's one of the kind of early gentrifiers that the city is trying to do in order to clean up Molenbeek. So. David, I don't hear you. David, microphone.
Susana, yeah.
Hi, I just want to actually interrogate a little bit. Erik, your presentation is very provocative, but I think that also there, and I too get really irritated at a lot of the ontological questions. However, if we go from myths, ontologies, epistemes, politics to practice as some kind of line of how things work, I think that one of the things that I would say is that if you look at the 1988 Constitution, which was devised from a lot of different kinds of ontologies, the Quilombolas participated, the indigenous population, and they used ideas about land and about ways of being that were not really very traditional. That's why I had the picture of the indigenous population and the American constitutional guys. Usually to my undergraduates, I make jokes about the hair, you know, the headgear. But the point is that there really were quite different things that were actually incarnated in politics. And you could argue that these are different kinds of political ecologies that were materialized in a political document that has its, you know, limitations. Also, the idea of the Pachamama and that nature has rights and so on. These are not, you know, I mean, I think we would like things to be more perfect, but they do create conditions of possibility that were really quite important. And so you went from a period of having very little, first of all, you went from having inhabited conservation areas as being understood not as set-asides, but being the potential for being inhabited by people and able to live their lives and have, you know, in complex ways, not just, you know, some kind of version of forest isolation. And it was significant in that it resulted in the setting in conservation areas of multiple types, inhabited conservation areas and sustainable development areas for traditional peoples, quilombolas, indigenous populations, that ended up being more than 60% of the Amazon. So this isn't nothing. And it does come out of a different ontology than, for example, that of Mr. Bolsonaro or the military regimes before it. So I think while a lot of, you know, who can stand to read a lot of that ontology literature? You know, you sort of go, but thinking about it as it actually materializes in historical politics, I think it's not entirely a waste of time to invoke it. And the other thing, I teach a course on collapsology right now, and I really agree with you about the unevenness of collapse.
Yeah.
And that when you see that, oh, it's just 2 degrees, you know, we have to keep under 2 degrees. Many people are already living the future.
Exactly.
You know, so one of the things that's very important, and I really agree with you here, is the unevenness of the dynamic. And I think that within that context of unevenness, you can find, I'm not a solutionist. I think that environmental degradation is a feature of capitalism, not a bug. So that there, you know, we're going to be seeing we're going to have to get some kind of shift, and we're going to have a really bad time coming up with these with climate change really hitting very hard in lots of different places. So the question that I guess what I have for you is, I would say that the political is important, but we also need to make sure that the ecology is important in that, and many of your examples don't really have very much ecology in it. They only sort of talk about nature as some kind of, you know, commodity in some way. So I lament that we can't be together. Actually, it's sort of, I mean, this is nice to be together this way, but one, I'm curious about what you would say about the incarnation and materialization of actual forms on the planet of ontologies materialized in these, you know, Amazonian conservation areas that involve people. And the second thing, I guess, is with a pluriverse, you have to start with variations in ontology. So I'm not again, I can barely stand to read that stuff, but if I think about it in a more material way, I think that it's not such a waste of time in terms of thinking about the political, since it is a way of organizing epistemes, politics, and practice.
No, I don't think I did say that it was pointless, let alone useless or not important to think these ontological questions. I actually think they do matter. What I was disputing is that such ontological shifts that do not operate within a process of political transformations or impotent. And your example precisely demonstrates that. That is, how do you bring these new knowledges, insights, epistemologies, whatever you want to call them, into the Constitution as the symbolic order, as common sense, A, B, but also as a constitution, as a legal document. Chile today,
materialized too, it does get materialized.
Chile today is a very, very good illustration of precisely that. If we look at the recent history of Chile, it has seen a successive manifestation of depoliticizing discontent that fused together not just ecologists, not just indigenous people, not just the working class, not just men, not just women, not just old people, not just young people, a whole range of people of a variety of knowledges, social subjectivities, and political embodiments came together and collectively, given the particular conjuncture, etc., succeeded with an overwhelming success, if I look at the results of the referendum 2 weeks ago, in making the initial claim that a new constitution has to be written. What exactly the content is going to be needs to be seen. That is precisely what is required. And that's precisely what I would argue political ecology, widely understood, needs to bring in. So, for example, I find it absolutely incomprehensible, intellectually speaking, that so much attention is paid to non-foundational ontologies. I mean, all these new ontologies are post-foundational and non-foundational. Not one of those interlocutors discusses post-foundational political thought and how that might articulate. There is no political theory, no political thought in what political ecologists do. And I am a bit generalizing here, but give me examples in the wide and big and very important field of political ecology that engages with critical post-foundational political theory and its potential transformative possibilities that are in there. I read a lot about indigeneity. I read a lot about subaltern difference, heterogeneity, identitarian preferences, and all the rest of that. Fine. It is absolutely vital. How does that articulate with political theories and perspectives that have the same sentiment? People like Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Agamben, Connolly, Wendy Brown in the US context. So there's a whole generation of new critical political theorists that are really, really important. And we, as far as I can tell, perhaps I am mistaken or I don't read enough around it, I see very few of the political ecologists that I engage with, that I read, who actually theoretically engage with that kind of thought. And I think that is a fundamental problem. And I would argue that has in part to do with how our generation thought and practiced political action as social movements. We identify politics with the actions of social movements or socio-ecological movements. And I think this is problematic. Social movements are social movements. And that's not enough in order to get the constitutional change, the change in the constitution, which is what we want, which is what we need, a change in the constitution. Yeah, whether it's the legal document, but also the commonsensical way in which we interact. And that is missing, and I don't quite understand it, that it is so little thinking around the politics of socio-ecological transformation and what we want, other than we want to have a pluriverse in which everyone can do whatever they want to do. Does that include Trump and Bolsonaro? What are we going to do with it? You know? And how does it articulate with the ongoing deepening dynamics of combined and uneven socio-ecological collapse? Yeah. I teach the kids in Amsterdam and in Manchester about sustainability. Amsterdam, one of the most sustainable cities, so they say, right? Which they buy at a gigantic ecological and social cost elsewhere, right? So what's happening in the avocado fields and the massive battle over water in Chile has to do with the avocado and quinoa hype of the cosmopolitan green people of Amsterdam. These two have to be articulated somehow if you want to get somewhere politically speaking. Or we can keep on dwelling in the pleasure of social activism, which is important. Again, I don't want to be too negative. I'm a social activist too. It's just not enough. If you want to think of the required political transformation, particularly in an age of rampant populism. Right? Rampant populism.
Thank you, Erik. I do think that political ecology is the right ground to think about agonistic politics and what is politics today and what will be politics in the next years. I can imagine that a lot of people here do think that this could be a ground for a real agonistic politics. And I think that for the new generations, it's perhaps the best ground to think and rethink about what politics is. But
possibly, yeah. I hope so. I hope, but that needs to be done then. I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Erik. I think we have to go out from the building. It was a very provocative talk. I can imagine that we will, each one on his own or with friends and people, follow the discussion. We will follow the discussion tomorrow. Thank you, Susana. Thank you a lot, Erik. Thank you for your energy and your provocation. Really, it was very, very interesting. Thank you, Johan, who is here. Thank you, Gabriela. So we will try to follow the discussion tomorrow. Thanks a lot. And I think the day is over, but we will have
I'll be here tomorrow.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Well,